He thought he was going to prison. Not maybe, not possibly. He had already calculated the years. 9 to 12. That's what federal sentencing guidelines suggested when the words conspiracy and defense contract manipulation were spoken in the same indictment. The courtroom felt smaller than it should have. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Sloan stood confidently before the jury. Sharp suit, controlled tone, certain. At 21:43, she said, pacing slowly, the defendant accessed a restricted procurement terminal. Within minutes, $7.8 million in routed defense allocations were redirected through a layered shell account. She turned. And that redirection crippled a supply chain tied to active military logistics, murmurs in the gallery. The word military always did that. Caleb Ward sat still at the defense table, hands folded, back straight, no visible reaction. That irritated Sloan, because panic is easier to prosecute. Calm makes jurors think. You resigned from Northbridge Infrastructure 2 weeks before this breach, Sloan continued, after being denied a senior compliance role. Yes, Caleb replied evenly. Resentment is a powerful motivator. Accountability is stronger, he said. A few heads turned. The judge cleared his throat. Sloan smiled thinly. Let's stick to facts, Mr. Ward. Facts. The prosecution had plenty. Logan credentials tied to Caleb, biometric confirmation from the terminal, security footage showing him entering the building that night, timestamp logs precise to the second. It looked airtight. He looked finished. And the jury felt it. 3 months earlier in Chicago, a quiet municipal audit had triggered resignations inside a transportation board. No headlines. But inside federal corridors, a name had circulated quietly. Ward, no official title, no public role, but present, watching. Now he was on the other side of the table. That was not an accident. Back in court, Sloan called her star witness, Martin Hale, Chief Operations Officer of Northbridge Infrastructure. He testified that Caleb had become increasingly confrontational after raising unfounded concerns about procurement layering. He accused us of diversion, Hale said smoothly. We found no evidence of that. Did Mr. Ward have access to the terminal used in the breach? Sloan asked. Yes. Did he possess administrative knowledge to execute it? Yes. Did anyone else enter that sub-level terminal between 2130 and 2200? No. Clean. Simple. Damaging. Sloan turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't complex. This is retaliation disguised as whistleblowing. She sat down, confident, because the narrative was easy to digest. A disgruntled employee sabotages his former employer. Federal crime, prison, case closed. In the back corner of the courtroom, a janitor slowly replaced a trash liner. No one looked at him, except Caleb, just for a fraction of a second. Recognition. The janitor didn't react. He continued working. But something shifted, because Caleb knew something Sloan didn't. The timestamp was wrong, not fabricated, incomplete, recess. Caleb's defense attorney leaned in. We're losing them. I know. You said there was a flaw in the logs. There is. Then where is it? Caleb glanced toward the hallway. It's not in the login record. Then where? In what they didn't expect to be reviewed. The attorney stared. That's not comforting. The janitor waited near the service corridor. When Caleb approached, he didn't stop mopping. You're cutting it close, the janitor said quietly. I needed them confident, Caleb replied. They are. Good. The janitor stopped moving. They scrubbed the terminal logs, he said, but they forgot the environmental variance data. Caleb nodded once. How clean? Very. Traceable? Yes. That was all Caleb needed, because servers generate heat. Heat generates fluctuation. Fluctuation generates automated environmental logging, and environmental systems don't lie to protect executives. Court resumed. Sloan prepared her closing trajectory, but Caleb's attorney stood. "Your Honor, we move to introduce supplemental building systems data." Sloan frowned. "On what basis?" "Thermal server logs from the night of the alleged breach." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Explain." The janitor entered the courtroom. Murmurs. Sloan looked irritated. "And you are?" "Daniel Ruiz," he said calmly. "Facilities operations." Sworn in, he spoke clearly. "When a restricted terminal is accessed locally, the server load increases. That produces a measurable heat spike in the server room. On the night in question, at 21:43, no such spike occurred." Sloan objected. "Speculation." "It's physics," Daniel replied. A ripple of restrained reaction. He continued. "There was a spike at 22:12. Sloan flipped through her files. "That's not when the funds moved." "No," Daniel said evenly. "That's when an administrative override console was accessed." The courtroom shifted because override access wasn't tied to Caleb. It was limited to 2 executive credentials. One of them belonged to Martin Hale. Sloan stood abruptly. "This is misdirection." Caleb spoke for the first time since morning. "Ask him if he entered the building at 22:10. Hale stiffened. "I did not." Daniel connected a drive to the courtroom display. Security footage, executive parking entrance, timestamp 22:09. Martin Hale scanning his badge, walking inside. The silence was absolute. Sloan looked at Hale. Hale looked at the screen, then at the jury, then at the judge. The collapse wasn't loud. It was quiet, like air leaving a room. Caleb remained seated, calm. Because this wasn't revenge, it was exposure. The judge called an immediate recess. Federal marshals moved discreetly. Hale's attorney began whispering urgently. Sloan's composure cracked for the first time. Outside, cameras were already gathering. Inside, the prosecution's case unraveled in under 3 minutes. Not because of emotion, not because of outrage, because of overlooked systems. Because someone assumed janitors didn't matter. Charges against Caleb Ward were dismissed pending investigation, but dismissal wasn't victory. It was ignition. Because once Hale was separated from his counsel, he started talking. And what he said shifted everything. Northbridge infrastructure wasn't siphoning randomly. It was routing fractional allocations across layered shells tied to a shadow contracting group known internally as Meridian Consolidated. Not public, not listed, but present in procurement chains across 4 cities: Chicago, Denver, Atlanta, now here. And each city had seen quiet financial anomalies, none prosecuted. Until now. That night, in a quiet federal building, a small oversight division convened. The Office of Structural Integrity, unpublicized, underfunded, but persistent. A whiteboard displayed city names, Chicago circled, Denver underlined, Atlanta marked, Baltimore added in red. A supervisor looked at the file. "Who is Ward?" an analyst responded. "He consulted during the Chicago audit. Unofficially." "Is he inside this?" "No." "Is he aware?" "Yes." The supervisor nodded slowly. "Keep him unofficial." Across town, in a glass office overlooking the harbor, a man watched the news feed without expression. Victor Halden. He was not on Northbridge payroll, but 3 shell entities feeding Meridian Consolidated traced back to a trust he controlled. He didn't panic. He recalibrated. "Contain Hale," he instructed calmly. "And Ward?" Halden paused. "Observe him." Because sometimes exposure reveals more than it threatens. And Halden wanted to know how much Caleb Ward actually understood. Late that night, Caleb stood alone on courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions. He ignored them. His phone vibrated once. Unknown number. He answered. "You made noise," the voice said. "Noise reveals structure," Caleb replied. A pause. "You think this ends with Hale?" "No." "Good." The line disconnected. Caleb looked out at the city lights. This wasn't about clearing his name. It was about something larger, a pattern of procurement manipulation hidden behind complexity, layered, protected, systemic, and now visible. Somewhere inside that structure, someone had underestimated a janitor, and someone else had just realized Ward wasn't the target. He was a variable. The city felt different, tighter, aware. And on a whiteboard inside a quiet federal office, Baltimore was circled twice. Because this wasn't a courtroom victory. It was the first fracture, and fractures spread, unseen. For now, the fracture did not spread loudly. It spread carefully. 48 hours after Hale's arrest, Northbridge Infrastructure announced a temporary leadership transition. Markets dipped, then stabilized. News cycles shifted. On the surface, the system absorbed the shock, but inside federal corridors, the temperature rose. The Office of Structural Integrity reconvened. Hale had started cooperating, not out of guilt, out of calculation. He knew he wasn't the architect. He was a node, and nodes are replaceable. Meridian Consolidated isn't a company, Hale said under controlled debrief. It's a routing mechanism. For what? An investigator asked. Discretion. That word lingered. Discretion for who? Hale hesitated. Then, for those who sit above procurement. He didn't say names. He didn't have them. He only knew instructions came from layered intermediaries tied to a strategic holding trust, Victor Halden's trust. But even Halden didn't attend the meetings. He received direction, filtered, clean, untraceable, until now. Caleb Ward did not return home after the dismissal. He checked into a short-term rental under a variation of his own name, not hiding, just reducing predictability. He knew the next phase wouldn't be legal. It would be structural. At 6:12 a.m., his phone buzzed. Secure number. "OS, I wants a conversation," the voice said. "Officially?" Caleb asked. "No." Location? Harbor District, Warehouse 12. He arrived alone. Inside, 3 individuals sat at a folding table surrounded by portable servers and whiteboards filled with city names. Chicago, Denver, Atlanta, Baltimore. Baltimore now marked in bold. A woman in a navy blazer stood. "Caleb Ward." "Unofficially," he replied. She didn't smile. "You triggered something." "I corrected a timestamp." "You exposed a routing mechanism." "Good." A pause. "You understand Meridian doesn't exist on paper. Most efficient structures don't." She studied him. "Victor Halden does." "Intermediary," Caleb said calmly. "You're certain?" "No." That answer held weight, because certainty in incomplete systems is dangerous. She slid a folder across the table. Northbridge wasn't the only anomaly. Procurement deviations across 4 cities show fractional extraction patterns, less than 1% per allocation, invisible individually, significant cumulatively. "Where does it go?" Caleb asked. "Layered shells tied to energy grid subcontractors." That was new. Defense routing was one thing, energy infrastructure was another. Energy meant leverage, not just money, control. Across the harbor, Victor Halden received confirmation that OSI had contacted Ward. He didn't react visibly, he expected it. "Accelerate compliance narrative," he told his communications director. "We support transparency, we welcome review. Optics, always optics." "And Ward?" she asked. "Monitor him." "Do we engage?" Halden paused. "Not yet. Because engagement reveals hierarchy. Observation reveals strategy." Back in the warehouse, Caleb studied the map projected on the wall. Energy grids overlaid with procurement routing, the same fractional siphoning, the same timing windows. "What's the end objective?" he asked. The OSI analyst answered carefully. "Liquidity pools." "For?" "Contingency influence." That phrase translated simply, funds that could move quietly when needed, to stabilize markets, to sway contracts, to cushion political transitions, or to pressure compliance. Caleb absorbed that. This isn't random corruption. No, the woman said. It's architecture. He nodded once. And architecture implies design. That evening, Caleb left the warehouse under subtle surveillance. He felt it immediately. A sedan pacing 2 blocks back. A pedestrian who paused twice without entering any building. Tier 1 intimidation. He didn't adjust. He walked into a public square filled with evening foot traffic and sat on a bench facing reflective glass. He sent a single message to Daniel. Escalation confirmed, Daniel replied minutes later. They'll test you. Let them. The test came the next morning. News outlets received an anonymous tip. Former compliance officer under investigation in Chicago resurfaced in Baltimore case. Selective facts, framed carefully. Caleb watched the segment without emotion. Discrediting phase. Predictable. OSI called within minutes. They're attempting reputational erosion. They'll escalate. We can issue clarification. No, Caleb said calmly. Let them overreach. The woman hesitated. That's risky. So is silence. Because when power feels threatened, it rarely moderates. It exposes itself. In a private conference room high above the harbor, Halden met with 2 men whose names never appeared on organizational charts. You assured us the exposure would be contained, one said. It is, Halden replied evenly. For now. And Ward? He's aligning with OSI. Then he's no longer unofficial. Halden held their gaze. You want removal? The second man leaned forward. We want stability. A thin distinction. Removal could be legal, financial, professional, or something less procedural. Halden understood the subtext. We apply pressure first, and if pressure fails, silence. Because escalation beyond pressure carries consequences that ripple, even for those above Halden. Back at the warehouse, OSI analysts flagged something new. Energy grid contracts in Denver showed a sudden rerouting of funds within hours of Hale's arrest. Damage control, the analyst muttered. Caleb studied the timeline. They're consolidating. To protect liquidity, the woman said. No, Caleb replied. To move it. Where? He zoomed out on the map. There. A federal storage complex in Virginia, classified routing hub, defense adjacent, energy adjacent, liquidity adjacent. Everything intersected there. That's not coincidence, Caleb said quietly. Late that night, Daniel called from an unlisted number. They're consolidating assets. I know. They won't let you reach the storage hub. They may not have a choice. Halden isn't the top. I know. A pause. There's a board. Caleb didn't speak for a moment. How many? Enough. That word again. Enough to insulate, enough to override, enough to redefine jurisdiction if necessary. The next day, Caleb received a formal letter. Summons to appear before a closed federal review panel regarding improper handling of procurement intelligence. It was a trap, not criminal, procedural, designed to classify him midstream. If they labeled him as handling sensitive material improperly, everything he touched could be sealed, buried. OSI convened immediately. They're invoking containment authority, the woman said. If I comply? Caleb asked. They control the narrative. If I refuse, they escalate. He considered it calmly. This isn't about me, he said. It is to them. No, he replied quietly. It's about visibility. He looked at the energy grid overlay, at the storage hub in Virginia, at the converging routes. They think classification ends this. And, she asked, it won't. That evening, Halden received word that the summons had been delivered. Will he appear? His associate asked. Halden stared out over the dark harbor. If he does, we bury him procedurally. And if he doesn't? Then he becomes defiant. Which helps. It forces acceleration. Halden didn't fear exposure. He feared unpredictability. Ward introduced unpredictability. and unpredictability destabilizes architecture. On the rooftop of his rental building, Caleb stood alone as wind cut across the city. His phone vibrated. Unknown secure number. He answered. "You're forcing alignment," the older voice said. "I'm forcing transparency," Caleb replied. "Transparency destabilizes necessary discretion." "Necessary for who?" Silence. "You're closer than you realize." "Closer to what?" "To the real structure." The line went dead. Caleb looked out over the city lights, defense contracts, energy grids, liquidity pools, shadow boards. He finally understood. This wasn't theft. It was a contingency network, built to operate outside public visibility, built in case institutions fractured. But without oversight, contingency becomes control, and control without accountability becomes corruption. Below him, traffic moved unaware. Inside federal buildings, review panels prepared to classify him. Inside boardrooms, strategies recalibrated. Inside OSI, escalation plans formed. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. This was no longer about prison. It was about whether hidden architecture could exist without consent, and whether exposing it would protect the public or destabilize the very systems that kept order intact. He opened his eyes, calm, measured, unshaken. Tomorrow, he would choose whether to step into that federal panel, and whichever choice he made, the system would respond, because structures protect themselves, and this one had just been touched. The next move would not be subtle. It would be decisive, unresolved, waiting. The Federal Review Panel convened at 9 a.m. sharp. Windowless room, dark wood table, no press, no public record. Caleb Ward entered alone. No attorney, no visible defiance, just composure. 3 officials sat across from him, 2 legal advisors, 1 senior oversight director whose name rarely appeared in public briefings. "Mr. Ward," the director began evenly, "you are here regarding the handling of procurement-sensitive intelligence tied to active federal infrastructure." "I corrected manipulated evidence in open court," Caleb replied calmly. "You exposed routing mechanisms that intersect classified systems." "I exposed redirection of public funds." The director leaned forward slightly. "You are not cleared to interpret national security contingencies." "And who is?" Caleb asked. Silence. One of the legal advisors slid a document forward. "Sign this acknowledgement. You will agree that further dissemination of related information requires federal clearance. Classification by consent. If he signed, everything narrowed. If he refused, escalation accelerated. He didn't touch the paper." "You're not asking for discretion," Caleb said quietly. "You're asking for silence." The director's expression hardened. "We are asking for structural stability." There it was again. Stability. The justification beneath everything. Caleb looked directly at him. Is siphoning fractional energy allocations part of structural stability? A flicker. Small, but real. The director didn't answer. Instead, "You misunderstand the scale of what you're interfering with." "Then clarify it." Another silence, longer. He wasn't being removed. He was being measured. The director finally spoke. "There are contingency architectures in place to ensure continuity during geopolitical shock. Those architectures require liquidity and discretionary maneuverability." "Outside public oversight?" Caleb asked. "Outside public volatility." A subtle distinction, but not a small one. "So, Meridian," Caleb said calmly, "is contingency infrastructure. Meridian is insulation. From accountability. From collapse." The air tightened, because now the philosophy was exposed. Is it corruption if it prevents crisis? Is it manipulation if it preserves order? Caleb leaned back slightly. "Then, why frame me?" The director didn't hesitate. "Because you weren't supposed to see the architecture. Truth, not hostility. just structural truth. Across town, Victor Halden received live updates. He's refusing to sign. Is he hostile? Halden asked. No. Emotional? No. Halden frowned faintly. Calm resistance was harder to dismantle than outrage. If he walks out uncontained, Halden said quietly, we lose narrative leverage. What's the alternative? Halden didn't answer immediately, because alternatives escalated quickly, and escalation attracts scrutiny from higher layers, layers even he didn't fully see. Back inside the review room, the director folded his hands. You believe transparency strengthens institutions. Yes, you are wrong. Then prove it, Caleb said. A pause. You don't have clearance for that proof. Then the public doesn't either. Silence again, measured, heavy. The director finally pushed the unsigned document aside. You will leave this room. You will not be detained, but understand something clearly. Caleb waited. You are now visible inside systems that were never designed to be visible. I assumed that. And if instability follows exposure, it won't be because I exposed it, Caleb replied calmly. It will be because it couldn't survive daylight. The director held his gaze for a long moment. Then, dismissed? Outside the building, media hadn't gathered. The panel was closed. But somewhere inside federal data logs, the meeting was recorded, time-stamped, referenced, traceable. That mattered. Because visibility now existed on both sides, not just in warehouses, not just in courtrooms, inside the architecture itself. At Warehouse 12, OSI waited. When Caleb entered, the woman stood. Well? They confirmed it, he said. Confirmed what? It's a contingency network designed to move liquidity during geopolitical shock. And Meridian? Insulation. The room went quiet. Because that reframed everything. This wasn't theft for luxury. It was structural maneuvering for crisis, but maneuvering without consent. And energy grids? The analyst asked. Leverage nodes, Caleb replied. Energy, defense, transport. Enough to redirect pressure where needed. Pressure on who? Anyone. That was the part that chilled the room. If contingency funds and infrastructure levers sat outside oversight, they could stabilize or coerce. Hours later, news broke unexpectedly. A congressional subcommittee announced a formal inquiry into continuity-based procurement architectures. The phrase was careful, not accusatory, not explosive, but real. The board had hoped to keep this internal. Now, it was procedural, public adjacent. Victor Halden saw the announcement on a silent monitor. He didn't flinch, but his knuckles tightened slightly around his glass. They moved too soon, his associate said. No, Halden replied quietly. We moved too late. Because once Congress attaches its name to a structure, it can't disappear quietly. It can adapt. It can reshape. But it can't pretend invisibility anymore. That night, Daniel finally reappeared in person. Warehouse 12. He stepped through the door without announcement. You walked out, he said to Caleb. Yes. They let you. They wanted to see if I'd accept containment. And you didn't. No. Daniel studied him carefully. Then, it shifts. How? They'll fracture internally. Because once oversight becomes visible, factions emerge, those who believe in insulation, and those who believe insulation went too far. Inside the board, someone had already leaked Phase 2. Inside federal architecture, someone had chosen not to detain him. Fractures. Small, but spreading. 3 days later, Martin Hale formally implicated Meridian under oath. Names surfaced, not the board, but Halden, directly. That mattered. Federal warrants were issued quietly. Halden received notice before agents arrived. Of course he did. He stood in his office overlooking the harbor for a long moment. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't afraid. He was calculating. When agents entered, He didn't resist. He adjusted his cuffs calmly. "Do you understand the charges?" one asked. "Yes," Halden replied evenly. "Misallocation of federal procurement assets." He gave the smallest nod. "You're focusing on the wrong layer." Maybe they were, but layers collapse from the outside inward, and Halden was outer insulation. Visible, replaceable. News exploded this time. Major infrastructure executive arrested in procurement scandal. Commentators split instantly. Necessary reform. Dangerous exposure of continuity systems. Political maneuvering. The moral debate ignited nationally. Was this justice? Or destabilization? Should contingency architectures exist beyond public oversight? Or does secrecy inevitably corrupt purpose? The country argued. Engagement surged, attention sharpened, exactly the kind of visibility the board feared. Late that night, Caleb stood once again on the courthouse steps where it had begun. No cameras now, just quiet wind. His phone vibrated. Unknown secure number. He answered. The older voice. "You collapsed an intermediary." "Yes." "You think that changes the structure?" "No." A pause. "But it makes it visible," Caleb continued. Silence lingered. "You forced evolution," the voice said finally. "Good. Evolution is unpredictable. So is concealment." Another pause. "You've made powerful enemies." "I assumed." "And uncertain allies." "I expected that too." The voice softened slightly. "Be careful what you dismantle." Caleb looked out at the city, energy grids humming, defense contracts rerouted, congressional hearings forming, Halden in custody. The structure wasn't gone, but it was no longer invisible. "That depends," Caleb said quietly. "On what?" "Whether it needed dismantling." The line went dead. Inside a quiet federal office, a whiteboard was updated. Chicago, addressed. Denver, under review. Atlanta, active. Baltimore, escalation complete. Beneath it, a new heading appeared. Continuity architecture, oversight pending. The supervisor capped his marker. "Ward? Still unofficial." "Good. Because unofficial variables are harder to neutralize, and sometimes they're necessary." Weeks later, congressional hearings began, measured, controlled, careful. The Board of Allocation was never named publicly, but its mechanisms were dissected, revised, restricted, bound to oversight committees, not eliminated, but no longer invisible. That was the shift, not destruction, exposure. Caleb watched the hearings from a quiet apartment. Daniel stood by the window. "Did we win?" Daniel asked. Caleb considered it. Halden was indicted, Meridian dissolved, energy routing audited, oversight expanded, but the deeper architecture? It adapted. "It's not about winning," Caleb said calmly. "It's about light." Daniel nodded slowly. "And now?" Caleb looked at his phone, a new message waiting, no sender ID, one line. "Next city ready." He didn't smile, he didn't sigh. He simply locked the screen. Because corruption wasn't the constant. Power was, and power always reorganizes. The difference now? It knew it could be seen. Caleb stepped toward the door, calm, measured, unshaken. Behind him, congressional debates continued. Ahead of him, another city, another layer, another test of whether stability requires secrecy or whether accountability can become the new architecture. He paused at the threshold, and for the first time since the courtroom, he allowed himself one quiet thought. Prison had never been the threat. Silence was. And silence, this time, had not survived.